Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to be talking through two types of selection that we have, stabilising in comparison with directional selection. Now usually taught before this in the topic are the ideas that come from Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, Wallace, Darwin, ideas about artificial and natural selection, and then it leads into this specific lesson that talks about alleles, allele frequency, and which ones are advantageous at which time, for example. Now there are four fundamental things that I want to get across in this video before we look specifically about these two types of selection. Now the first key thing to note is that different environmental conditions act as what are called selection pressures, and what they do is favour different characteristics in the population. So we're just going to make a note of that. Before we talk about stabilising specifically versus directional, let's just make a note of this key principle here, that you have different environmental conditions. So different environmental conditions act as what are called, and this is a really key term, selection pressures. Okay, and different characteristics in the population are favoured as a result of these selection pressures. Now these environmental factors may be biotic or abiotic. Now by that I mean living or non-living. So let's just make a little note of that. So these selection pressures can either be abiotic or biotic. And if we were to put an example to these, so a non-living component could be, for example, the level of rainfall or precipitation. So the ones that prefer wet kind of climates would thrive there. And biotic would be, for example, the predators, a living component of environment that may favour one particular group of organisms over another. So what you've got there is the idea of selection pressures that are going to favour certain characteristics in a population. Now selection, so this word here when we say types of selection, what we're referring to is the process by which organisms that adapt better to a changing environment tending to survive, thrive and reproduce, passing on their alleles to their offspring. So selection is the process by which organisms that can better adapt ultimately will go on to survive and have children with these beneficial kind of traits. Now these adaptations that I'm talking about, they can be anatomical, physiological or even just behavioural. Now the key thing is that advantageous alleles become more frequent in the population. So that is a really key statement just to make. So for those that can adapt to those selective pressures, so those that can better adapt, just make a little note about this to start with, those that can better adapt, survive, thrive, reproduce, and this is the key thing, pass on their advantageous alleles. So allele frequency increases. Now this is a term that A-level syllabuses are much more keen on students using this term, allele frequency. So we've got two key things here, one about the different selection pressures and one saying that those that can better adapt are more likely to survive and thrive and reproduce. Now as part of this, it's important to talk about the word polygene. A polygene, or well, actually most characteristics are influenced by more than one gene, and that's what we refer to as a polygene. So particular traits or characteristics that have more than one gene that can possibly affect it. Now the environment has a more pronounced effect on these particular genes as opposed to ones that will simply influence just one characteristic. Now, the variation that we get in a population of these traits shows what's called a normal distribution curve when you plot the data that you have, and it's selection that will alter this curve. So you may be familiar. Let's draw the particular graph that I'm referring to. So if we were to look at a particular population in terms of the variation of a particular polygene, you get something characteristic that looks a bit like this, a normal distribution curve. This is our original population. So we're just going to label this here. This is our original population. Now with stabilising selection, so with the first one, with stabilising selection, what we do is favour the average individuals, or the phenotypes about the mean being this central line here on the graph right in the middle. So we're favouring the average, and we're implying that these organisms are best adapted to that particular environment. Now with this sort of selection pressure, the extremes of the range may be less advantageous or even actually just disadvantageous, and so they are selected against. So we're actually selecting against the extremes. So we're favouring the average individuals, and this is known as stabilising selection. Now when we select against the extremes, what we find, two things. One, that this actually is occurring in a stable population, because we're favouring the average, we're removing the two extremes, the very large on this end, the very small potential on this end. If we're favouring the average, then that population is more likely to be a stable population, but what we're actually doing, in effect, is reducing the range of possible phenotypes. And that's a really key thing to mention, that with this type of selection, we're actually reducing the range of phenotypes. Now, phenotypes are like the physical characteristic or traits that we observe. So if we think about genotype, referring to the actual genetic makeup, the letters, if you like, that we use to represent genes, the phenotypes are the physical traits that we actually see expressed in a population. So in stabilising selection, we're actually reducing the range of phenotypes. Now, a good example of stabilising selection would be birth weight in babies. So for a baby that is very, very low birth weight, there are complications during development, and that's less likely to survive. For babies that are particularly large, what we find is that there are problems necessarily giving birth, actually problems during delivery because of the large baby's weight and size. And so actually we're more likely to have a successful birth should that baby be of average weight. Another good classic example are plants, or the height of plants. Very, very low level, very small plants don't adapt well necessarily because they don't have access to sunlight for photosynthesis. So most likely taller plants are going to outcompete them for the light. But equally, if they're very, very tall, then they're exposed to wind damage. So tall, much taller plants are more exposed to the wind, more prone to damage. So actually, in terms of plant height, again, we're favouring the average. And they're examples of stabilising selection. But let's talk now about what happens when we, and in fact, just to finish off this particular graph, what we'll do is draw in, and I'll draw this in a different colour just to make it stand out. So this is now our new population. So if we compare this graph to our original population, we can see not only do we have a greater, where I put an asterisk here, a greater number of organisms in the average category, we've also removed essentially these parts here. We've weaned out the extremes and removed those from our graph. Now let's look at directional selection and see how that changes. So we've talked about stabilising. Let's look at what happens with directional selection. So if we have our original population again, so let's just draw that in. Probably a bit steeper than intending, but here is our original population. Now with directional selection, one extreme of the trait distribution is actually selected against, but previously disadvantageous alleles may this time be selected for. Now over time, what you see is the mean shifting in the direction of these individuals who possess a phenotype that's actually more suited to the new conditions. They will survive, thrive, reproduce, and pass on their alleles. And we find that this kind of selection happens in fluctuating populations. So what we're saying now is that we may select against one extreme, but actually another type of extreme may be advantageous. And we shift the entire population towards that extreme. If that extreme trait, for example, is beneficial in the environment, then more of those organisms would survive, thrive, so the population is more likely over time to reflect them. So we're actually favouring one extreme. So what we get, if we were to draw the curve for this, as I did with the previous, is a complete shift of the curve to one side. So this again is our new population. We've favoured one particular extreme, and again this was happening in a fluctuating population. So a really good example of this is if we think about the development of antibiotic resistance. If we take MRSA, for example, so methicillin resistant Staphylococcus aureus, type of bacteria that became resistant to methicillin antibiotic, a penicillin derivative. It's not that, there's one key thing to say, it's not that these bacteria all of a sudden mutated to become resistant to this particular antibiotic. Mutations are spontaneous, they're random. So ultimately, some bacteria spontaneously mutated, and the mutations gave them the kind of necessary protection they needed to destroy ultimately the methicillin antibiotic, or to be resistant to its effects. A lot of antibiotics work by puncturing the cell wall that surrounds a bacterium, and if that bacteria is resistant to that, it's more likely to survive, thrive, reproduce. And we know that bacteria reproduce asexually, so clearly those bacteria who've mutated and developed this resistance to this antibiotic have survived, thrived, reproduced, and created a whole generation of bacteria that are resistant to the effects of this antibiotic. Ones that don't have this mutated allele, if you like, will die out, and this extreme version of this bacteria survives, and we get a shift in the population, and that's what's shown in this directional selection graph. So there we've got the two types of selection, stabilising versus directional. The key thing is that stabilising favours the average individuals, and we almost eliminating the extremes of the range of phenotypes. For directional selection, we're actually favouring one extreme and shifting the population in that particular direction. Okay, hope all that helps.